O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night and the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love will thy life destroy. That's a poem from one of my favorite poets, William Blake, and today I want to talk to you about my top 5 favorite poets, because I dip into poetry every now and then. I don't just do fiction. I don't just do nonfiction. I don't know whether you classify poetry as fiction or nonfiction, but I want to talk about them nevertheless. I'm Logan Albright, and this is another book review for your enjoyment. All right, we started with William Blake, so let's start there. This is my copy of Songs of Innocence and Experience. He was an English poet, and he did these beautiful illustrations. That's one of his right there, of all his poetry. And he has some famous ones. Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright is one that you may know. Songs of Innocence are a little bit simplistic, I guess. They're a little bit very benign, and I don't like those as much, but the Songs of Experience can get quite dark. And they're short poems. They're not that involved, but I think he's got a real way with words, and I love the imagery that he conjures up, especially in conjunction with his illustrations. So William Blake, he wrote a lot about theology as well. He did The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, but his most famous ones are the Songs of Innocence and Experience, and these are an easy way to dip your toe into some poetry that's not that hard to understand, and it's quite lovely. He's an older writer, but I think his poems have held up very well, and I recommend him. Number 2 is the classic, Edgar Allan Poe. I know it's a little bit cliche, and a lot of poetry scholars don't regard him as a great poet. They think his short stories are better, but I think his poetry is absolutely amazing. Everyone knows The Raven, of course, which is his most famous poem, but he's got many others which are very evocative, very dark, very gothic. You know, he's got The Haunted Castle, he's got The Conqueror Worm, he's got The Bells, which is a wonderful euphonious celebration of the different types of bells and the kind of emotions they evoke. I love that poem immensely. It's great. All of his poetry is very evocative, and it really takes you to that Edgar Allan Poe place that you like to go. And now that we're getting into fall a little bit, I think it's excellent to dip back in and read some more Poe, because you can never read too much Poe, especially when it gets close to Halloween. Continuing on my dark poetry theme, I have Charles Baudelaire, Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil. Baudelaire is a French poet, as you may have guessed, and he wrote this collection of poems, The Flowers of Evil, which is very dark and very sensual, very passionate poetry. He, delved into some of the darker things in life as well. He didn't seem like a very happy person, but I think his poetry is great. Whenever I read poetry in a language that is not English, I like to get a translation as well as the original text. So this edition that I have, this translation, it's a good translation, but it's also got the original French in the back, which I like. My French isn't amazing. I can't really read it without a dictionary, but it's nice to be able to refer to the original, especially when you have a translation that is not strictly literal, where he kind of takes some poetic license and tries to make the poems rhyme or tries to make them fit into an English meter a little bit more than the French would. So I like to have both. But Baudelaire's poems are very passionate and evocative and dark and beautiful, and it delves into the darker side of life. I think it's something that'll take you to another place. And in terms of French poets, I think he's one of the best. You may know, if you've watched my channel, that my favorite author of all time is Victor Hugo, and he also wrote immense quantities of French poetry. But I've never really been moved by his poetry. I think his poetry, it's all kind of like, oh, look at the lake by the tree. Isn't it nice? Isn't it pretty? Or a lot of it's religious poetry, and it just doesn't really do much for me. But Baudelaire really touches something deep in the human condition and the emotions, and I think his poetry is excellent. Next, we'll return to England, where I have the poetry of John Milton here. John Milton is a 17th century poet, best known, of course, for Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost is an epic poem that's very long, but I regard it to be one of the finest poetic works, if not the finest poetic work in the English language. Paradise Lost is where we get a lot of our conceptions of the devil and of hell from. He coined many, many words that we now use in English, including pandemonium, which is the palace that Satan constructs in hell. It means all demons. It's a fantastic poem. It reads so beautiful even today, and parts of it are kind of hard to understand because it's written in iambic pentameter. It doesn't rhyme. It's a little bit like Shakespeare in that regard, but I prefer Milton to Shakespeare. And apart from Paradise Lost, he has a lot of other poems. One of his best ones is called L'Allegro, which means the cheerful one. For some reason, he wrote the title in Italian, even though the poem is in English. And that contains the first usage of the term "trip the light fantastic." So Milton gave us an immense amount of phrases and words, and just it was a gift to the English language. He was blind when he wrote Paradise Lost, and he dictated the whole thing to his daughter to transcribe from him. It's an astonishing work that he was able to come down from his bedroom every night and just dictate pages and pages of this epic poem from memory. He claims to have been divinely inspired, and maybe he was, who knows. But man, the poem really holds up and is beautiful. Milton's one of my absolute favorites. And number 5, I should say that these are not in any particular order. I'm not saying I like one more than the other. These are just a jumbled list of the poets that I've encountered that I happen to enjoy. So number 5 is the Irish poet W.B. Yeats from the late 19th century, early 20th century. Yeats was very into his own culture of the history of Ireland and the Celtic mythology, Celtic legends and stories. There's a lot about fairies and druids in his poems, which I really like. It really appeals to my sensibilities. He was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the famous magical order in Britain that kind of started what we know as modern magic today, and that really carries through in his poetry as well. There's a lot of great symbolism. There's a lot of great imagery of, what we think of when we think of Celtic mythology and Celtic legends. We think of a lot of those types of images, and there's a lot about the Irish landscape as well, the green rolling hills, the beautiful oceans. It's just got, it's very picturesque. If you like those sort of word paintings where he really takes you to a place and evokes a location in your mind, I think Yeats is great for that. I don't have any particular poems to single out. He varies his style a lot in terms of meter and rhyme, but there's a lot there. This is his complete works in a really small edition. I think it's complete. Yeah, it says collected poems, so I think that's all of them. And there's lots of different collections. There's an awful lot there, but they're all very enjoyable. And I'm going to Ireland at the end of October, so I wanted to study up on my Irish poetry, so I would be in the mood. And I think there's no better poet to do that for you than the classic W.B. Yeats. So those are my 5 favorite poets. There's many others I could have mentioned. There's little kind of minor poets like Lewis Carroll, who did Alice in Wonderland. Some of his poetry is excellent, although he's not primarily known as a poet. If you like nonsense poetry, that sort of thing is really nice. I really like J.R.R. Tolkien's poetry. He's known for the Lord of the Rings and stuff, but he wrote some poetry as well, and some of his poems I think are just fantastic. But I didn't include them in this list because they're not major poets, and they didn't write that much poetry. But those 5 are great starting places, especially if you like sort of the darker, more magical side of poetry, a little bit less realistic than me. Some people like kind of a more gritty, naturalistic poetry like Charles Bukowski and people like that. Not my style, not going for it. So I like these guys. They're very, lyrical in that regard, and they have lots of kind of magical, mystical imagery in them, which I always find delightful. So there you go, my 5 favorite poets. I hope you found that enlightening. I hope that you will check out these poets and read them yourself and let me know what you think. If you have poets that you think I should read that I haven't read, or you have particular favorites that you'd like to point out, please feel free to leave a comment and I will respond and review it. And as always, I would appreciate it if you would like and subscribe to my channel as well. I will see you next time with another video. Thanks so much for watching. I've been Logan Albright, and I'll catch you later.